In today's video, I'm going to try and create everything for the first time while making the tutorial. I have a base idea of something that I want to create, but I have no idea how I'm going to create it. So let's create this particular sci-fi tunnel for the first time along with all of you. So with that, let's actually begin this particular experiment. I know that I want to use geometry nodes, so I'm going to keep the default cube and I'm going to open the geometry node workspace by bringing my cursor to the junction of these two windows, clicking and dragging to create a new window. Now I'm going to switch this from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor, and I'll press this plus button to create a new node tree. Now I essentially want there to be some type of a tunnel, and I want the tunnel to be square itself. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the group input, and I'll tap Shift A and search for a cube. Now this cube I'm going to plug into the group input, and I'm going to go ahead and just change the size on the y-axis to maybe 10 meters, and I'll keep the x and the y at maybe 2 meters. I might change this when I actually start playing around with it, but for now that should be good. Next up, if I actually go to my wireframe view, I can see what this looks like. I want to create many more cuts. So I'm just going to increase the number of vertices on the Y to maybe something like, let's go with 20. And similarly on the Z, which is going to be these. Yeah, I'm going to have to go ahead and increase these to maybe something like 5. So I think that works. Yeah. But of course, I don't want there to be any plane at the front or at the back. So I'm going to have to go ahead and delete those. In order to delete those, I'm going to have to go ahead and press Shift A, search for a delete geometry. And I know that they have normals facing in the Y direction. So let's go ahead and use that. Let's press Shift A, search for a normal node, and I'm going to search for a dot product. So let's search for a vector math node. If you want to know more about how the vector math node works, definitely check out this video over here where we explain exactly what the dot product and all of those are. So let's search for the dot product. Now I want to do the dot product with the y-axis. So let's change this to 1. And I want the absolute value. So let's press Shift A, search for a math node. Let's change this from add to absolute. So let's go ahead and search for absolute. I can't find that. So let's press that. Now let's go ahead and plug that in right over here. And now I have to compare this value with some number. So let's press Shift A, search for a compare node. And this time I'm going to make sure that if it is greater than, let's start with 0. Let's have it be deleted. And then let's I would have played around with this value in case it didn't get deleted, but it did get deleted. But there are some issues. If you actually place this, okay, no, there are no issues. The issue that I was looking at is we also require these to have some serrations. Let's go ahead and increase that. That is the number of vertices on the x-axis. So we'll change that to 5 as well. And that gives us nice little squares on top. We have squares at the bottom, and essentially we have squares everywhere. So that looks great. Let's go back into our perspective view. And now I want each of these faces to get a cube. So for that, let's first convert these from faces to points. So let's press Shift A, search for a mesh to points node, and plug that in right over here. Now on these points, I want to instance a cube. So let's press Shift A, search for an instance on points node, and plug that in. But of course, I don't want this to be on every single point, so I'll use a random value for that later on. Let's search for a cube node and plug that into the instance. Now let's go ahead and reduce the size of the cube. Let's change that down to maybe 0.01 or maybe 0.1. Let's just keep it like that, and we'll play around with this scale later on. So let's increase this, make it 0.5, no, 0.25 maybe, and then we'll play around with this scale. For the selection, let's press Shift A, search for a random value node, and we're going to switch this to Boolean because we just want it to be yes or no. So let's change this to Boolean. Let's plug that in, and I don't want the probability to be 0.5. Let's reduce this. No, let's increase the probability just so that a few are missing here and there. Okay, this looks like a good enough distribution. The next thing is the scale. So let's press Shift A, search for another random value node, and plug that into the scale. Now the minimum doesn't have to be 0. We can have the minimum at something like 0.25, and that looks good enough. Now that I have this sort of separation, I want each of these to actually be beveled. Now to bevel this, we can't just use a bevel node, which still doesn't exist. So because bevel doesn't exist, we're going to have to first subdivide the mesh. And after that, we're going to have to subdivide the surface. So let's subdivide the mesh. Let's just see how much subdivisions we're adding in. Level 2, maybe let's go with level 3. Now that we have that, or let's go with level 2 itself, or maybe I don't need this. Let's just leave this for now. Let's press Shift A, search for a subdivision surface, and hopefully there's an edge crease. Yes, of course, there's an edge crease. So we can actually just increase the edge crease, and we still do require some amount of subdivision. Do we? No, this works just as much. Great, we have that edge crease, and that is good enough. We don't need the subdivide mesh node. That looks great. So now that we have that, we can make sure that it's shaded smooth by pressing Shift A and searching for a set shade smooth. So then we can go ahead and plug that in right there. And this is what we have. Soft cubes. That looks great. Why I'm using these soft cubes is because I know that I will want to add in some amount of lighting and reflections. So I think they'll look better on these rounded edges. Let's just go ahead and increase the edge crease a little bit more, but I still feel like it is becoming too hard. I'm not exactly getting the type that I wanted. So maybe I have to just increase the subdivision level. So yeah, that seems to be better. Now that that is done, let's go ahead and start off with the materials. So let's press Shift A, search for a set material node and plug that in right over there. For the material, let's just choose the default material because we're not using that anywhere else as of now. Now, before we start the shading, let's switch this workspace from geometry node to the shader editor. Let's switch our viewport shading to rendered. Let's go ahead and switch over to our render properties, switch on bloom and screen space reflections, and finally just select the light and press Alt G to clear its location. Now, with the light settings, I'll just reduce the power to something like 500, and I'll press GY followed by 5 to just bring it to the absolute start of this particular object. Now we're going to go ahead and select the object and play around with the actual material. I want most of these to be completely metallic, so let's increase the metallic all the way to 1. We'll reduce the roughness to maybe 0.3 for now. That will give really nice reflections. Next, I want a random few of these to actually light up. So for that, we're going to press Shift A and search for an emission node. So let's search for emission. And let's go ahead and move this over here and press Shift A, search for a mix shader. Now, again, this is just trial and error that I'm working. I know that maybe something like this should work, but let's see. I'll search for an object info node, and the object info node should have a random socket. Now, this should be random for every individual object. Because these are still instances, it should have a random value for every instance. Now that I look at it, of course, that shouldn't work because this is giving us a range between 0 to 1. I want it to either be 0 or 1. So in order to do that, I'm going to press Shift A, search for a compare node. And because we're in the shader editor, there is no compare node. We have to search for a math node and switch that from add to less than or greater than. Let's start off with less than. So if it's less than 0.5, it should become this emission. Otherwise, it'll take on the principal. Now that looks great. I want much fewer of them to actually be emissive. So I'll change this threshold to maybe 0.2. And that makes a few of them emissive, which is exactly what I wanted. Maybe I'll increase it a bit, make it 0.3. Now I want half of these emission cubes to have a different color. So the first thing that I'll do is just increase the strength by quite a bit. Maybe not that much. Let's give it a strength of 5. That'll just have a really nice bloom. And then for the colors, I want 2 different colors. Let's press Shift A, search for a color ramp node, and let's plug that in right over here. Now I'm going to change this from linear to constant. I'll bring this in, maybe make the position 0.5, and I'll change the 2 colors. So maybe I'll go with a blue-green aesthetic. So let's go ahead and change this to this sort of a bluish color, and this white, instead of the white, I'll make it this sort of a greenish color. Then for this factor, I'm going to use this random value that we created, maybe another version. So let's press Shift D. And to randomize this random socket, we can go ahead and figure something out because obviously there is no seed. So what I could have done is given a random value from geometry node itself as an attribute, but let's just see what happens if I first start this random value as a factor. I think all of them will end up getting the blue because all the random values with a threshold less than 0.3 are becoming lit anyway. So they're all going to have a value less than this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remap this random value so that everything that goes from 0 to 3 should go from 0 to 1. That should work. So let's press Shift A, search for a map range node, plug that in right here. Now I know that the random values are going to go from 0 to 3 anyway. So let's go from 0 to 0.3, and that gets mapped to 0 to 1 and makes all of them lit, which is exactly what I wanted. So that is great. Now let's also make sure that this is AGX so that the bright values become slightly desaturated, which makes it look much brighter. So let's switch that over to AGX, and yes, that looks a lot better. Now that we have this sort of a look, let's go ahead and make sure that the metallic section is completely white. So let's just bring this up all the way to white. And for our actual light, let's not have that as a white, but let's give it that same bluish look. Now that might be a bit overpowering, so I'm going to reduce this from 500 to 250. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to just press GX1 and I'm going to press Shift D X -2, and I will give this maybe a greenish color. I don't know if that's going to work, if it's going to look nice, but again, I'm just testing this out. I know for a fact that I do want two different colors. Let's just move these inward a bit and let's see what this looks like for the time being. Yeah, all right, we'll leave it as is for now. Let's go to the world and just change this to a blackish color, and that looks good. Now what I want is many more copies of this, except further out, and in fact I actually want to increase the number of subdivisions that we created for this. So in order to do that, let's go to the geometry node editor, and after this grid, let's just subdivide it by pressing Shift A, search for a subdivide mesh node, make sure that the level is set to 1 so that we don't actually overload it by accident, and plug that in. Now that looks a lot more filled, but I do want a few more of them to be deleted. So for the delete geometry, let's just slightly increase that random value. So we were deleting it where we were, instancing it where there. Yes, we weren't deleting any of the points. We were just instancing on random points. So let's just reduce that probability so that a few of them do disappear. Yeah, so let's keep it at a probability of 0.5. So I think that looks good, and we can go ahead and create the instances of it. And I also want fewer of them to be lit up. We'll do that in the shader editor in a while, but let's go ahead and duplicate this. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to press Shift A, search for a bunch of points, and I'm just going to make 3 points for now so that there are 3 layers. Now I'm going to instance this entire thing on each of these points. So let's press Shift A, search for an instance on points node, and plug that in to the points. And for the instance, let's plug this. For the scale, I'm going to use the instance index. So let's press Shift A, search for an index node. Now the index node should give a different index for each instance. So let's go ahead and just plug that in over here. And the indices are 1, 2, and 3. Let's just see how that looks by plugging this into the geometry right there. So now we do get 1, 2, and 3. I think there's 0, 1, 2. So let's press Shift A, search for a math node, plug that in right over here, and let's just add a value of 1. So yeah, now we have 1, 2, and 3. But I don't want these to be increasing in scale on the y-axis. So I'm going to have to just remove this from the y-axis. Let's press Shift A, search for a combine XYZ node. Let's plug that in right there. And let's just plug this into the X and the Z. We'll keep the Y at a value of 1. So now that we have that created, that looks great, but of course, okay, the instances are not looking great. So what do we do? Instead of having the instance on points over there, let's create this entire points thing up front. So let's take these and shift everything over to the side. So the reason why I'm creating this video by itself is to show that, yeah, I also don't get everything at the first try. I do a little bit of playing around before I get something that looks good, and then I create a tutorial on it. So hopefully this will give you a realistic idea of how long it takes somebody who uses Blender on a regular basis to create these animations. So yeah, let's now take these points and this instance on points and press Shift D, bring it back over here. In fact, not just those. I should have taken all of these, pressed Shift D, brought them in over here. And now let's just go ahead and select these and Control X. Okay, so that didn't work. Let's just plug that back in. Now let's take this, plug that into the instance so that we're just getting the points to go up, and then plug this into the points. So, okay, that still does the same thing because they are taking on the scale of the points. So what I should do is realize the instances. Press Shift A, search for realize instances, plug that in right there, and that should fix it. And yes, it does fix it. So now we have everything perfectly all right. We have layers of these cubes, and I still don't think they're looking great. What I want is the cubes that are outside should also be rotated. So let's just actually rotate them around the y-axis. So press Shift D, and this time this value is going to go on the y-axis. Plug that into the rotation. Of course, I can use some map range to change these rotation values, but I'll leave them like this for now. Or maybe I'll just press Shift A, search for a map range, and plug that in right there. It's going from 0 to 3. Actually, it's going from 1 to 3. So let's change that from 1 to 3. And we'll change that from 0 to, let's say there are 3 of them. Let's go with, let's see, 45 to 90 degrees. So 0 to 90, and 90 degrees is pi by 2. So let's change that to pi by 2. And that does that. So that's one operation that you could do, or maybe make it go to 45 degrees so that you have 22.5. So maybe pi by 4. So let's change that to pi by 4, which is 90 by 4. So that makes that. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like from this orientation. And yeah, I think that looks better. We'll just keep it like that for now. The next thing that we need to do is make sure that a few of them are not lit. Let's go back to the shader editor. Let's change this threshold to be maybe 0.2 or maybe 0.15 so that only a few of them are lit, and that would also have to change this to a value of 0.15. So yeah, now much fewer are lit up. Maybe I don't need these lights. Let's just hide them for the time being. Let's switch off overlays, and it actually looks great without the lights. I don't know if I need the lights, but yeah, no, the lights do add quite a bit of a difference. Maybe we'll keep them for now. We'll take a look at what we do to them later, but let's go ahead and duplicate this entire thing. So let's select this entire thing, press Alt D to create a linked duplicate, move it on the y-axis by 10 units, which was the length of the entire tunnel. Now let's press Shift R to just duplicate that action a few times, or repeat the action a few times. And now we have to start off with the animation. So let's go ahead and select the camera. Let's press Alt G to clear its location, Alt R to clear its rotation. Now we'll press RX90 to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Now we'll press 0 to go into the camera view, and this is what we have. Now that does not look great, so let's go to the camera properties, change the focal length down to something like 15, and that looks a lot better. Next, we'll go to the viewport display and increase passpar 2 all the way to 1 so that we don't see anything outside the camera's view. Next, let's actually add in a little bit of haze in the background, but right now we're doing the animation, so let's not get sidetracked. To ensure that this loops, I have to make sure that these lights always follow the camera. So let's select the lights, and you could add a constraint where it stays this far from the camera, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select the camera after this and then press Ctrl P and choose Set Parent to Object. So now they are children of the camera, and wherever the camera moves, the lights move along with it. Next, let's animate or keyframe the camera by selecting it, going to frame number 0 and adding in a keyframe. So let's just tap I and choose location, rotation, and scale. If you're using Blender version 4.1 or above, remember you have to press K to get the menu for location, rotation, and scale. I will just add in active keyframes. So that's something I'll have to test out when I download Blender version 4.1. So stay tuned for those videos as well. Probably the next video onwards will be in 4.1. However, now let's change the end value to maybe 600 so that it's a 10-second long loop. But I have to go over to my output properties. I'm going to change the frame rate to 60 frames per second. And I'm going to change the resolution to 200% so that we get a 4K animation. Remember, if you don't want to render this out yourself, you can buy the 4K render along with the blend file and a few wallpapers from my Patreon store. Or you can sign up to the monthly tiers where you'll get every single one of the animations, blend files, and wallpapers based on which tier you are that are released throughout the month. Next, on frame 600, I want to move this by the length of one tunnel. So I'm just going to have to press G and follow it by Y and then press 10 to move it by 10 units. Now I'll press Enter, I, and I'll choose location, rotation, scale. Now this would create a motion forward, and to make sure that it's looping, I'll come down here and I'll press T linear. But if I don't want it to only move forward, I can actually make it rotate about its y-axis, and I might do that. So what I'm going to do is I'll change the playback from play every frame to frame dropping so that I see how fast this is actually moving. In case it moves way too fast, I'm going to have to slow it down, but I think this speed is good enough for now. A little bit of motion blur might also add to this effect, but we'll look at that later. For the time being, let's just see what it looks like if I was to rotate it about the y-axis as well. So let's just go back to frame 600 and I'll press R, Y 360 and I'll press I, location, rotation and scale. Now this rotation is going to start off slow and it'll rotate faster in the middle. But if I make it such that the keyframes are set to linear, it'll rotate in a smooth loop. Now I might want it to be in a smooth loop, or I might keep them at Bezier itself, and I might change the interpolation so that it starts off slow, speeds up in the middle, and then slows down at the end even more. Like I will amplify that effect. Let's just go down and choose these rotations. And okay, the rotation is already set to linear. Let's just go ahead and press T and change it to Bezier. Now with the Bezier handles selected, let's just hide everything except for the Y rotation. Remember, this is in my graph editor. Let's just select just these two. Make sure that we have individual origins selected. So over here, the pivot point has to be the individual centers. Now we'll press S and we'll scale it up on the X axis. So that will just enhance the speed in the center. It'll actually start off much slower, then it'll speed up in the middle a lot faster, and then it'll slow down again. Now I'm gonna have to actually test these out to find out what works and what doesn't. But for the time being, this is what I'm leaving it at. But I am seeing an issue with the random values. So between the different objects, because we are shading it based on the random island, we are not going to get this to work. That is an issue. What's happening is every time we click Alt D, the islands are different, so the shading is also different. So the easiest fix is the way that I already know, which is doing this in Geometry Node Editor itself. Let's store a random value for every instance. So let's press Shift A, search for a store named attribute. Let's plug that in right over here. Now we're going to be storing a different value for every one of the instances. So let's go ahead and change this from point to instance. The name can be random value, so I'll just name it RV for now. Now the value has to be a random value. So let's press Shift A, search for a random value and plug that in right over there. We can change the seed to something random as well. Let's just make it a seed of 5. Now let's go over to our shader editor. And for the material, let's go ahead and switch this object info node to that stored attribute node. So let's press Shift A, search for an attribute. And remember, we want this for all of the instances. So we're going to have to change the type from geometry to instancer. The name was RV. And now we can take this factor and plug the factor into the value. Similarly, let's take this same node. Let's just press Shift D or just drag this over to the side, delete this node and use this factor in this value as well. Now let's go ahead and switch off the overlays. It should be a perfect loop. So once we ensure that it is a perfect loop, which it is, we can go ahead and add in some volumetrics. For that, we're going to switch from object to world in the shader editor. And if you can't see the nodes, just press period on your numpad. If that doesn't work, tap A and then period to centralize the nodes. If that is not centralizing anything, then you don't have nodes, so you're going to have to add them in manually. So now let's press Shift A and search for a volume scatter node. And we're just going to plug that into the world output. It's going to be far too potent right at the start. So we're going to reduce the density from 1 to something like 0.1. And that should just reduce the effect. Now the lights right at the back are going to actually make the fog more visible, but this should get us what we want. Now we have to ensure that the last few regions are absolutely not visible when we go all the way to frame 600, which is our last frame. So let's go to frame 600. And now between frame 600 and 0, we shouldn't see any new boxes appear, which will ensure that it's a perfect loop. So when we switch to frame 0, we do see a bunch of new things appearing. So let's fix that by just increasing the density to maybe 0.2. So I think that looks great because there's absolutely no difference now. Apart from that, it looks good over here as well. Let's do something about the lights. Just maybe I'll select the lights and I'll increase the radius from 0.1 to maybe 0.5, which should just remove that bright spot. Let's do the same thing for light 0.01. So let's increase the radius to 0.5 and that looks a lot better for my scene. Now the one issue that I feel is the further we go out, the more concentrated these objects should have been. So that is something that we might have to work on. That would involve going back to our Geometry Node Editor and playing around with these. We'd have to change the entire setup actually, but I think this is good enough. You could do something where you check if the position is greater than a certain distance. All of those points could be duplicated, and after duplicating it, you could move them around by some random position. That would work, but I don't think that's necessary. I think this looks good as is. So we'll just leave it like that. Just a few outliers here and there. I want these to be a lot brighter. Let's go back to the shader editor, select these, go to the object. Let's go to the emission node and just increase the strength even more, maybe a value of 10. And now in my render properties, for the look, instead of none, I'll make it high contrast. So I think that looks a lot better. And everything else that's remaining is just playing around here and there. So maybe I'll go to the volumetrics and I'll just switch on volumetric shadows as well. And I think that's good. Let's not play around with anything too much, especially since this video has already become fairly long. I might not keep this rotation. Instead, I could add in maybe a camera shake or something. We'll take a look at that. For another additional movement, what I could do is add in motion blur. So let's switch on motion blur over here, and I'll keep it on the default for now. Maybe we can add in a little bit of depth of field. So let's select our camera, go to the camera properties, switch on depth of field. Now let's just reduce the f-stop to maybe 1.2, and that looks pretty good. I think that's all there is. Once you're happy with the way everything looks, you can select whichever output folder you want. You can choose the file format. I'm always going to choose FFmpeg video because it results in much smaller file sizes. Container, I'm going to choose MPEG-4 with an output quality of perceptually lossless. With that, let's go ahead and press render animation. I hope this video was useful and gave you a bit of an insight into the way at least my mind works when I'm trying to figure out some type of animations. But the entire channel was started with me just creating time lapse of me trying things out for the first time so that people could get an idea of the mistakes that we make and the different trial and error phases that we go through while creating any animation that we create. Since most of my videos have been tutorials where I've already tried and tested everything before creating the animation, I feel like it's necessary for me to release 1 or 2 videos at least of this style from time to time. Let me know if you like this format and whether you want more fast-paced tutorials or slower tutorials as well, because I want to try and create a balance between all of them. I'm working on a new series that I will be releasing very, very soon, where we'll have very long videos that go into the absolute depths of the working of certain aspects of Blender. I already have a few videos that go into the depth of the light path node. I have videos on the Voronoi texture that I released very recently. Definitely check that out if you haven't already. But I want to go even deeper into Blender in the coming videos. So definitely stay tuned for that. Let me know what type of tutorials you'd want to watch. And until my next video comes out, thank you so much for watching. Keep creating and don't forget to stay creative.